Hello, it's Jacek Bartosiak, Strategy and Future. Today, my guest is Paul Scharre. Hello, Paul. How are you doing?
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Okay, it's our pleasure to host you in our show. Paul is the Vice President of Center for a New American Security, an author of the great book that I reviewed, that Strategy and Future. The full name is, the full title of the book is Army of None, Autonomous Weapons, and the Future of War. Uh, I found this book great. You can access Strategy and Future to see the review, just as I said. And of course, I will ask my guest today about the contents, the thoughts that are in the book. But before we start, and in order to have a good sort of the opening of the discussion, I would kindly ask you, Paul, to sort of introduce yourself in terms of AI and where do you have your knowledge about AI? AI, on purpose, I like to mention that AI is something of a mystery, for regular people. AI, battlefield, how come does it have anything to do with each other? And if you just could give us a brief description, how come you sort of come across this subject and dealt with it, and in what form, what organization, and so on. So please go ahead.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for the very kind words about the book. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I've been working in the field of national security for over 20 years. I started out at the bottom as an enlisted soldier in the U.S. Army. I was an Army Ranger. I did multiple tours overseas to Iraq and Afghanistan during the conflicts there. And that, I think, really grounds my understanding and thinking about conflict. And that very much informs how I continue to think about warfare. After leaving the Army, I transitioned to being a civilian in the Pentagon. After graduate school, I went to the Pentagon, worked as a civilian policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And I worked on a lot of emerging technology issues there. So at the time, this is when the US military was really waking up to the robotics revolution. We deployed thousands of air and ground robots in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, overhead drones doing aerial surveillance, and then ground robots doing things like diffusing roadside bombs. And I combined my battlefield experience with working on emerging technology to try to better understand what are the tools that the US military needs to be more effective in future conflict. And one of the areas I worked on very heavily was on autonomy and autonomous weapons. I ended up writing I led the working group inside the Defense Department that wrote the Defense Department policy on autonomy and weapons that was published in 2012. It's online. You can see it on the government website. And then after working in the Defense Department, I came to the Center for a New American Security, where I work now, and have been working on defense and technology issues since then. I've participated on autonomous weapons in discussions at the United Nations over the course of several years, talking to delegates from other countries about this topic. And as we've seen AI technology continue to mature, I've worked very closely with AI companies, both big companies and small startups, those that work with the military, those that don't, those in the U.S. and other countries. I've talked to executives and engineers at AI companies in China about what are they building and how do they work with the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think it's really important working on these tech issues to really, if you want to understand how technology is changing warfare, to combine it with a very deep understanding of the technology itself. How is it evolving? Talking to scientists and engineers, what are they building? But also an understanding of how does conflict unfold? And what are some, in some ways, some timeless truths of warfare, regardless of the technology involved.
Thank you for that, for this short intro. So let's start from the beginning, from the what is the autonomous weapon then?
So the idea of autonomous weapon is really quite simple. It's a weapon that would go out on the battlefield and choose which targets to attack all by itself. So these are still weapons that are built by humans, designed by humans. They're launched out into the battlefield by humans for a purpose. So we're not talking about, rogue robots building robots. But once sent out into the battlefield, they can complete an entire targeting cycle all by themselves. So they can search for enemy targets, find them, identify them, make a decision. And that's a bit of an anthropomorphic word, decision. But they have some kind of programming that allows them to decide to go ahead and attack this target and then carry out the attack all by themselves. There are, by and large, these weapons are not in use today. There are many ways in which militaries use autonomy or automation or autonomous systems in parts of that engagement chain or kill chain. But there are not that many weapons where they're fully autonomous and there's the weapon completing all of it on their own. Although there are some isolated cases. And over time, we're certainly seeing militaries incorporate more autonomy in future weapons that they're developing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and what is artificial intelligence in that sense?
Well, artificial intelligence is certainly a related concept, but they're not exactly the same. And I'm glad you asked, because it's important to tease apart some of those distinctions. The field of artificial intelligence is sort of best thought of as a scientific field like chemistry or biology. And artificial intelligence is the science of trying to build intelligent machines. It's something people have been working on since the mid-20th century, since the 1950s. It's a pretty broad and expansive field of science and engineering, and it involves a whole variety of different methods. And AI researchers can use a whole bunch of different approaches to try to build an intelligent machine. They could involve Bayesian learning and probabilistic learning or machine learning or optimization or evolutionary algorithms. There's a whole variety of approaches. And AI researchers will use what works for that particular instance. And what sort of tool works might vary considerably depending on what problem you're trying to solve. One subfield of artificial intelligence is machine learning, where machines are trained what to do rather than programmed with a certain set of rules of behavior. So older AI systems had handcrafted rules that were written by humans. A great example of this is a commercial airline autopilot. It has a set of rules for what to do in any given situation that's based on decisions between aerospace engineers, pilots, and computer programmers saying, okay, if we're getting this set of inputs, what do we want the aircraft to do? Machine learning systems are different. They're given a goal, and then they learn behavior based on data, either data that's fed to them or interactions with their environment. And that's been where there's been just a huge explosion in the last decade is in machine learning, and a particular type of machine learning called deep learning that uses deep neural networks. But it's different than autonomy, because autonomy is really about freedom. It's about the freedom that you give any kind of agent, could be a machine or a person, to carry out a task. So you could have a very intelligent system that doesn't have much autonomy. It's just giving, say, recommendations to a human. Or you could have a very simple system that has a lot of autonomy. A landmine would be an example. It has the ability to blow up on its own and kill someone or destroy a vehicle, but it's not really very intelligent at all. And so it's important to differentiate between those when we're thinking about what kinds of machines we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. What about the as we speak, there is, of course, the war in Ukraine, and in order to better understand for our audience how autonomous weapons could operate in the battlefield like Ukrainian one, and people are very close now to watching the events unfolding. Would you just try to describe to our audience how AI and autonomous weaponry would change the battlefield if it were present in numbers and control even OODA loop or kill chain, and if you just could say something about kill chain, what it means, and so on and so forth. In the example of the Ukraine battlefield, I think it might be more digestible for the audience to understand what AI in military is all about.
Absolutely. Well, we're certainly seeing, a very violent conflict unfolding in Ukraine right now. I realize it's certainly a lot closer to home for maybe viewers and listeners in Poland than here, but it's certainly one that people are tracking very closely around the world. And I know that defense experts here in Washington are looking closely at not just how the conflict is unfolding, but also the use of different technologies in the war as it's continuing to evolve. One of the things that I guess is striking to start with is how evident it's been in Ukraine about the importance of non-material factors in conflict. And so I think it's worth maybe mentioning that and highlighting that, that even as there are some instances where technology has played a really significant role, whether it's certainly in intelligence to support operations, and we see a huge disparity between Russia and Ukraine in terms of the effectiveness of their intelligence and how informed their decision-making is in the battlefield. Certainly we've seen some novel uses of drones, particularly by Ukrainian armed forces, commercial drones, as well as military drones like the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 that's being used quite effectively. But I just want to highlight, there are, all of the dominant factors in the conflict so far appear to be things like morale, command and control, willingness to fight, training, things like basic maintenance and discipline among the armed forces that are things that are overwhelmingly in Ukraine's favor and benefit them and are causing them to perform so well on the battlefield relative to Russian military forces that in many ways have material advantages in numbers and advanced weaponry, but just aren't employing them very effectively. So I think when it's sort of important to set the stage, because you think about something like autonomous weapons. So what might an autonomous weapon look like, first of all? Well, we're seeing drones employed, both small commercially available drones like DJI quadcopters that the Ukrainian military is using. There are civilians that are working very closely with the Ukrainian military, and they're partnering to take these quadcopters and employ them. There have been even instances where they have been used with Starlink commercial satellite technology, which, as far as I know, may be the first instance of commercially, available drones being used with a commercial satellite link, which is a pretty novel innovation. That's a technology that sort of really used to be just in the hands of not just militaries, but really pretty advanced militaries to be able to fly a drone via satellite communications. So we're seeing a lot of innovation with drones, but all of these drones are controlled by people. They're being flown by people, even when they have, and we have said some allegations, I guess, some reports of machine learning capabilities being employed on these drones. So the ability to do, for example, object detection and recognition. Now that's very valuable, that you could have a drone overhead that's not just surveying an area, but instead of people having to then, look through the drone scope and try to identify objects, if you could have an AI system identify things and say, there's a person, there's a combat vehicle, there's a tank or a fighting vehicle or a truck, that could be very valuable in helping to identify objects of interest. And that technology to do object classification is pretty widely available now. You can go online and download trained neural networks that can do that for free. They're publicly available if someone has the skills to employ them. And for, frankly, a reasonably competent computer programmer, they can, if you know how to program in Python, you can download those and use them pretty effectively. So we're starting to see at least some reports of those being employed. But even still, it's worth pointing out that if you have a drone, and even if you have some kind of AI-based image classification system on the drone that's identifying objects, there are still humans telling the drone where to go and then approving strikes that might be carried out. So an autonomous weapon would be one where we take the human out of that loop entirely. Yeah. So the humans might launch the drone into an area and say, well, we think that there are enemy forces in this area. And then there's some ability for the drone to identify these enemy forces using some kind of AI-based image classifier. And then once it finds a valid target with some probability of accuracy, the drone is authorized to just carry out that strike all on their own and strike the target. So that's what an autonomous weapon would be. It's worth, to your question about what would that mean in the conflict, I guess a couple of things. One is that any weapon needs to be employed effectively to be valuable. And so going back to my earlier point about the importance of training and morale, we've certainly seen a lot of weapons that Russia has fielded that look great on paper. In the hands of a different military, they might be very effective, but their training is so poor, the maintenance on them has been ineffective because of perhaps corruption within their armed forces, that they're just not being used effectively. And so autonomous weapons, they're not magic. They're a weapon system like any others. And so if it's used ineffectively, or if the people employing it are not trained effectively, or they haven't done maintenance on it, it's not going to work. But even if they are being used effectively, one big hurdle today is that the AI-based image classifiers are not very reliable. And so they can do very well in some settings, but then they're very brittle based on the data sets they were trained on. So what does that mean? Well, let's say, for example, that you had a lot of images of valid enemy targets in your environment, and you fed these images into your training data set, but they were all taken during the summer. And now you get to the winter, and there's snow on the ground, there's snow covering the treetops, there's snow on the vehicles. A person could still see that's a tank. It's just now a tank with some snow on it. That's not a problem for humans. But the AI system, it doesn't know that. It doesn't know what snow is unless you trained it on images of things covered in snow. And so sometimes their performance can drop off pretty significantly. So that would be one limitation. The other thing worth pointing out is that you only really need to sort of take the human completely out of the loop if you don't have reliable communications links. And we see a lot of the battlefield is still very contested. The skies over Ukraine are still very contested. There is obviously some degree of contest in the electromagnetic spectrum with jamming or with techniques that are allowed to basically pinpoint the location of drone operators, which then you can call in artillery fire on top of them. So that's one benefit of an autonomous weapon. If it was good, if it was reliable, then you could operate it without having that communications link, which might be good if your communications were jammed, or if you were worried about the controller being pinpointed with artillery strikes and you wanted to be able to launch the weapon and then not give away your position. So those are some of the ways that autonomous weapons might conceivably change that conflict if they were employed.
Bob Work, the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, actually also the person that initiated Third Offset strategy that I think involves some elements of also AI application on the battlefield, and a huge proponent of moving towards AI as a major game changer on the battlefield, has been saying that the introduction of AI into the military operations will change the calculus of both parties and will create such a swift OODA loop that the decision-making process between observation, orientation, decision, and action, that a party, an actor that doesn't have AI will stand no chance. So what is your assessment, especially in the OODA loop, right? And and this core element, the center of gravity of the contemporary wars, as war in Ukraine is showing, by the way, who's having the better situational awareness and is capable within its control and command, observe, orient itself, and issue orders, usually is the winner, right, in this battlefield. So what is your assessment, and how would you approach this issue, AI as a sort of a multiplier of OODA loop?
Right, that's a great question. Certainly the OODA loop paradigm of war, popularized by John Boyd is that what really matters in combat is not necessarily who has more mass or more firepower, but who's able to complete this process of observing the battlefield or the combat environment, orienting themselves towards it, making a decision, and then taking action faster than the adversary. And that if you can complete that loop faster than your adversary, then you are affecting the battlefield, you're changing, you're carrying out attacks, you're maneuvering, you're shifting your own position faster than they have time to react. And I think it's a pretty valid paradigm of warfare. We've seen it play out in other conflicts, certainly in both U.S. invasions of Iraq. I think, saw the effectiveness of that kind of philosophy played out. And I think there's a strong element of that that we're seeing in Ukraine, particularly with the recent Ukrainian offensive that's been so successful, pushing back Russian forces. So the ability to sort of understand what's happening, make a decision, and then marshal your forces effectively. And there's a lot of components of that where AI can be very helpful. One of them is just understanding the battle space. That's absolutely a place where AI can be very valuable, and putting out more robotic sensors to detect information, more drones, more ground sensors at sea, more undersea robotic vehicles or surface vessels to detect the enemy, more AI to then try to identify objects. What is this that I'm looking at? Is it a tank? Is it a vehicle? Is it a person? Processing that information, synthesizing it, bringing it together into a holistic picture. AI can help with all of that to help the understand piece. AI can also help sort of build options for decision making. So several years ago, there was an AI system that achieved superhuman performance at poker. And it was very good at exploring different kinds of possibilities. And the engineers behind that are now using that for wargaming, for exploring a vast number of different possible scenarios. And you can imagine that if people are trying to explore what kinds of courses of action could we take here, there's only so many that you can really go through in detail. Maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 10, maybe 20, but you're not going to go through thousands of possible scenarios. That's just not practical. But machines could do that. Machines could explore millions of possible scenarios and counter moves and then try to analyze them and maybe come up with some novel ideas. Certainly on the decision-making side, machines can make decisions faster than humans. They're not always better, but they are faster. We've seen that in all sorts of applications, from high-frequency trading, where in the stock market, machines are making trades in milliseconds. And there's this whole new domain of trading where really it's just machines interacting with machines. And humans are out of the loop entirely in high-frequency trading. All the way to things like automatic braking on cars, where if you're about to run into the vehicle in front of you on a high-end automobile today, automatic braking might stop the car. Or in military systems, things like automatic ground collision avoidance that takes control of an aircraft before it crashes into the ground, saving the life of the pilot. They've saved the lives of a number of pilots since they've been implemented. Or active protection systems for ground vehicles, where if there's a rocket-propelled grenade or a missile coming into a ground vehicle, active protection systems can fire off an interceptor to intercept that, to defeat the threat before they come in. And there's no time for humans to respond. So machines are very good at speed. They're not as good at having a sort of holistic understanding of the context. That's a big limitation of machines today. But they're better at speed.
Paul, if I may, the context is everything, and there's a very good example in your book that still the humans understand the context of certain behaviors. You talk about your own experience in Afghanistan, I guess, about the little girl, that you sort of had this sort of liberty to choose whether she was an active actor in the military operation against you, because under the international and so on and so forth. So, and that would go also along with my next question. So, where are we now in terms of AI application? Because if it's gonna develop so fast as you're describing, we will be very soon overwhelmed by competitive edge of countries employing AI like China. That they don't have such probably constraints on application of those systems in terms of the some values or regulations or this contextualizations. So first of all, where are we in employing AI in battlefield? What will be the year when you could confidently say that, yeah, it will be AI dominated battlefield for sure? And of course, how you define, depending how you define it, and whether United States is still at edge in employing this new technology, or not so much. For example, maybe China is better at it.
Yeah, all great questions. I think the short answer is that we're at the early stages. The field of AI has been around for decades, but the big explosion in deep learning is really only a decade old, and the technology is still maturing. It's starting to work its way out of research labs into the real world. But militaries tend to be relatively slow as bureaucracy is going. I think they're clearly lagging the commercial sector. And so there's a bit of a time lag in incorporating AI technology. Now, the US military's first AI-based system that it deployed out in the field was in 2017, late 2017, so almost 5 years now, where Project Maven, under then Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, who spearheaded it, that brought in some very initial image classifiers identifying objects through drone feeds and fielded them out in a real world environment. And we're starting to see more AI systems, but it is pretty slow. So I think that for the near term, we're going to very much still have an human dominated battlefield for, I would say, at least the next 10, 20 years, maybe longer, maybe 30 years or longer. But over time, it's quite likely that we will shift to a place where AI is embedded in every part of military operations, the same way that computers are today, or electricity. And that will transform warfare. The Industrial Revolution in the 1800s changed warfare dramatically, increasing the physical scale of destructiveness of warfare, the amount of iron and firepower and steel that militaries could field on the battlefield, and dramatically changed war in World War I and World War II, the scale of destructiveness, both at the tactical level, like in trench warfare, and at the strategic level with things like aerial bombing of cities. So I think AI will do the same, increasing the pace of operations, changing the cognitive aspects of warfare.
Yeah. And who is ahead? China or United States?
Right. Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think from a national standpoint, it's pretty clear that if you just set aside the military for a moment, that the United States is still the global leader in AI. China is number 2, but is rapidly catching up and on track to overtake the US in probably the next decade or so, if not sooner. And Europe is behind in number 3, but still very strong collectively in artificial intelligence. Now, in the military side, the US maybe has a slight advantage, but the reality is that AI technology is very widely available. If you just look at what's going on in Ukraine, I mean, the sort of signature drone is the Turkish TB2 drone, right? So Turkey is a major, regional power. They're a significant country, but they're not, one of the largest militaries in the world or most technologically advanced. And so that, I think, just points to how widely available this technology is. Even ISIS had drone capabilities in Iraq and Syria that were, reasonably effective. They certainly were able to call casualties against Iraqi forces and destroy ground vehicles. So, this technology is a very level playing field, which could be good or bad depending on where you sit. Lots of countries and even non-state groups are going to have access to AI technology. And what we've seen from the history of major military technical revolutions, of new technologies changing warfare like submarines or aircraft or tanks, is that what matters most is actually not who gets there first or even who has the best technology, but who finds the best ways of using it. That figuring out how this technology changes warfare and how you can use it not just to be better, but to actually fight differently, those are the things that really unlock game-changing effects in the battlefield. And that's going to be, pretty much a dead even race between many, many different countries and actors in terms of employing AI.
In your book, there are very nice examples of how AI and robotics might change also psychology on the battlefield. Yeah, for example, usually when people are asked whether they want to send their sons and daughters to the military or they would prefer sending the robots that are being manufactured in the factories, of course they choose to send robots. But if in the same poll they're being asked whether they would like to be attacked by the robots and AI-based systems or by humans, even of the most cruel nature, they still prefer being attacked by humans. And that means that robots and AI might have a shocking psychological effect in terms of the violence application. So what does it mean for AI, Paul? What does it mean for the future military? If that were, and of course also they are more dispendable, so you can waste them and you don't care too much because it's not a political burden, political liability. If you lose a soldier, it has he or she has a family and everything, but robotics don't. So that might also change the sort of the threshold of hostilities for the politicians. What are your thoughts about those two issues?
Yeah, these are great questions, and they're difficult ones because you're sort of trying to gaze into a very murky crystal ball to try to understand how people might respond to the technology. We can see where the technology might go, but how people react to it or use it is often maybe more uncertain. I think some of them are pretty clear, like who wouldn't rather send the robot rather than risking the lives of their sons and daughters in a war? That makes sense. One of the things that's quite interesting in the way that we've seen artificial intelligence employed in games is that the AI systems fight differently than humans in things like strategy games like chess or Go, or computer games like StarCraft or Dota 2. One of the things that they're able to do, certainly they're faster than humans. They're able to sort of see a wider swath of the action. They're able to engage in sometimes long-range planning better. But something they're doing that's really quite interesting is they're able to sustain levels of aggressiveness and pressure that humans can't do.
Yeah, they are not
Even
high.
the
I mean,
top,
the fatigue, even the mental and physical fatigue present
exactly.
with humans. Mhm.
Right. So in games like these sort of complex real-time computer strategy games like StarCraft and Dota 2, even among professional human players, there are lulls in action, right? A battle ends and then they have to pivot their attention elsewhere and kind of orient to that and then respond. And the AI can do that basically instantly. And so the human players will say that they felt like they were pressured constantly, always on the defensive. There's never a moment of rest. This is the same in poker, where what humans talk about is not just that the AI system is better at calculating probabilities, but that it makes these wild and dramatic swings and bets, these small bets, these very huge bets. That's not really how humans play. And even for professional human poker players, who might have, nerves of ice, for them, these wild and dramatic swings put a lot of pressure on them. And it's very difficult to respond to that. So when you think about that in warfare, there are natural ebbs and flows in combat. People have to sleep, they have to rest, they have to eat. And so the offensive might stall out. There are going to be lulls in combat over time. That may not be the case when warfare is driven by machines. Those machines don't need to rest. They don't need to psychologically recover from things. They might need more ammunition. They might need more fuel. But changing the psychological element of warfare could, I think, have a really significant effect on human combatants who are on the other side of that. If there's never a moment's to rest. I mean, people talk about this in a computer game that might last an hour, it being stressful. For combat that could last for days or weeks or months at a time, that could be mentally very straining.
Yeah. So, and the last question I would have, Paul. So, literally, what would be the asset, the military asset, driven by AI that would change the rules of the game in the coming years or decades on the land battlefield? So, what is your guess?
I actually think the biggest things will not be in the sort of tip of the spear combat action, but in back end processes like information processing, understanding intelligence, logistics, that will have the maintenance. Those are things have the biggest effect on military's effectiveness, right? Because if you could use AI to optimize your logistics or your information processing or your maintenance, and you made all of those just 10% better, so that your maintenance, your fleet maintenance was 10% better, or your logistics was just more likely to get the right things on time, that adds up to a huge advantage. And most of what militaries do is not, really on the fighting edge. It's really the logistics, it's the communications, it's all the back end. That's where most of the operations are. And we've certainly seen in the war in Ukraine the significance of those things, of command and control, of intelligence, of logistics. And that's a place where I think there's a lot of potential for AI to have major advantages. The technology is pretty ripe to be used in those applications today. Those kind of sidestep a lot of the really difficult legal and moral and ethical issues that people are uncomfortable with. And the cumulative effect of those could be very dramatic on the battlefield.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul, for a very interesting conversation. And I recommend everybody to read this book, Army of None, about the future of warfare and AI applications and autonomous weaponry. I found reading very insightful and very good read, by the way, Paul, for you to know. So even for the non-native speakers, that was a fascinating read about the future. And I hope that you still have plenty to achieve in writing books about the future of the military and the battlefield. Thank you very much. Our guest today was Paul Scharre. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I should also add, the book's been translated into a dozen languages, so it's available in a variety of different languages if you'd like.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you very much. And you please stay with us for more episodes to come. Thank you.
Thanks.